everybody. Welcome to this very special event, Changing Fashion. What do people want from a greener clothing industry? My name is Lucy Siegel and I am the chair. You're very welcome. Happy Earth Day if you're watching this live. If you're watching it on catch up, hope you had a good Earth Day. I, just for a little bit of context, am a writer and journalist and broadcaster. And I suppose the fashion industry and fashion supply chain is my first eco love. So I wrote a book called To Die For: Is Fashion Wearing Out the World back in 2011. Weirdly, it's having a bit of a resurgence this Earth Day. So thank you if you're part of that. Even on TikTok, would you believe it? That was the basis for True Cost, which was a documentary that appeared on Netflix in 2015. And since then, I've obviously been involved in lots of attempts to fix the fashion industry. And I'm sure I know many of you. So thank you for joining us. I think we've got lots of people who make up different parts of this quite complex jigsaw. And we are really here to talk about the new report, Changing Fashion. What do people want from a greener clothing industry from Green Alliance? And also the sort of companion report from PwC, Circular Fashion, Making Resale a Reality. Oh, my camera is apparently off. Is it on now? Is it on now? Maybe somebody could tell me. I don't know. Yes, it's on. Hi, sorry about that. Technical problems. You're not missing much if you can't see me. Let's put it that way. So we are going to hear in a minute from Alex Proudfoot, who's a senior manager at PwC. Then we'll hear from Libby Peake, who many of you will know, who's head of resource policy at Green Alliance. And then we'll bring in Sarah Ottaway, who is the sustainability and social value lead at Suez Recycling and Recovery UK. I think you can definitely see me now. Anyway, hello again, if you've just seen me. And then we will have a bit of a chat, a bit of a back and forth. And then, of course, we want your questions. All before 1 o'clock. I better get a move on, hadn't I? This is a obviously very full issue, let's put it that way. I don't think it's complex. I think there's lots of like markers. And I think this report sheds a lot of light. If you've signed up for the webinar, and you have because you're here, you will have got the report in your emails. So do read it. It's nice and short and very to the point. So I think that's really helpful. So we are really going to discuss how we're going to transform this fashion sector, but we're also going to bring in this insight of what the public actually will tolerate and what there's appetite for, which I think is super interesting. So without further ado, let me hand over to Alex Proudfoot, who's going to present the findings from PwC's report, Circular Fashion, Making Resale a Reality report. Alex, welcome and over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and hi everyone. Happy Earth Day. So as Lucy said, I'm a senior manager in PwC's strategy arm. I work primarily with retail and consumer goods clients, and in particular focus around how we can drive more circular business models and how we can make that profitable for businesses. So clearly in the fashion space, this is a really important question. And I guess I'm here today, first of all, just to give a quick overview as to our report, Circular Fashion, Making Resale a Reality. And thank you for sharing the link there if anyone's interested. So our work was really focused around two key questions. We get a lot of interest from clients in circular fashion and how it can be made to work. And we really went into our report trying to answer two questions. And those questions were, which model of circular economy should be prioritized for the fashion industry? There's lots of noise out there around different models, whether it's recycling, reuse, repair. We wanted to try and assess which one the industry should go after. And then secondly, the other question we typically receive is around how can this be made profitable? There's a lot of growth in the space, but there is often challenges around profitability. So we really set out to answer these questions in our report. And I guess if I take each of those in turn and run you through what we found, and then we can kind of open up for questions afterwards. So the first question really around which business model should be pursued to make fashion more circular is a key one, because it has real ramifications for the business model of fashion companies. And actually, what you see if you follow a kind of traditional waste hierarchy, which would be, reduce and then reuse and then recycle, the answer should be obvious. But what there is out there within the fashion sector in particular is a lot of studies that show quite conflicting answers. And so our clients ask us the question all the time, which one do we pursue? Which do we go down? How do we make sense of all this? So what we tried to do to get underneath the skin of this is really look at the data behind a lot of these impact assessments and understanding from an environmental perspective, which is the way to go. And what we found looking at these studies is actually when looking at the environmental impact across reuse, across recycling, what it all really comes down to is two key variables with a lot of assumptions behind them. So the first one is displacement rate, which is effectively how many new items of clothing are displaced by the purchase of a second-hand item of clothing. And the second variable that's really important is the recycled content within clothing. So what share of a new item of clothing is made up of recycled content? And actually, interestingly, across a lot of the studies, the inputs for those variables was hugely varied. So the way we tried to cut through it is we actually ran around 50 scenarios comparing different inputs for those variables to understand how the mix looks across different assumptions. And what we found is that in 90% of scenarios, reuse comes out as more environmentally beneficial than recycling. And if you take a central scenario for that, it comes out at around 10 times the impact. So what that's to say is reuse clearly is the model within circular fashion that should be prioritized, which obviously would align with what you see in waste hierarchies. It's not to say that recycling isn't hugely important and will not play a huge role going forwards in making fashion a greener industry, just that if businesses are really thinking about which to prioritize, it should be around getting reuse right. Which I think brings us quite nicely to our second question that we tried to address within the report, and hopefully some of you have seen it, which is around how can reuse be made to be profitable and how can it scale profitably? As you've probably seen over the last few years, there's huge interest and excitement in the reuse of fashion, and lots of different marketplaces have popped up. Lots of different businesses are trying to get involved directly, whether that's brands or new startups. And what you've seen is that industry itself is growing at around 20% per year. So really high growth, kind of over 3 times the growth of the wider fashion industry. So it's really an exciting space. But actually, aside from a smaller number of companies, there's been challenges with profitability in the sector. And that's certainly a key question from investors in the space. And what we tried to assess is we tried to look at it from the revenue side and the cost side to understand what's driving that and what are the levers that could be pulled to address it. So if I go through each of those in turn, from a revenue perspective, what we really wanted to understand in this research is what drives the retention of value from the primary market, so the sale of new clothes, into the secondary market, so secondhand fashion. And what we saw is that actually as you probably imagine, there's huge variability in even the same item, how much value is retained into the secondary market. We typically see around 25 to 40% of the original price retained into the secondary market, but actually there's huge variance even either side of that range. And there's a number of different factors that go into that, but probably the first one to highlight is brand, which is probably to be expected, but there's huge intangible value in the brands and originally put to market, and that means a significant amount of value can be retained. I think the second variable, which is probably the most interesting and exciting for us, though, and potentially surprised us at the extent to which it mattered, was just the channel and the platform an item is sold through. So, what that is to say is that actually the same item can be sold through different channels and retain a huge amount more value. And what we saw is that from a more simplistic channel, like maybe a charity store or a more basic marketplace, through to what we would see as a kind of really value-added channel, which might involve the authentication of a product, the repair of a product, really kind of top-notch merchandising, you can see around 2 to 5 times the value retained for exactly the same item. So this clearly shows there's a huge amount of value on the table for businesses to go after if they can address some of consumers' key concerns within the secondhand fashion market, which is normally around trust and product quality. So huge opportunity there we saw, which is really interesting. From the cost side of things, there's a number of things we could go into, but probably the key element to draw out here is whilst there's a huge variety of different types of costs that are applicable across different models, the key one that comes up across each different type of model of circular fashion is labor costs. in many instances accounting for over 50% of the business's costs. Now, this is clearly challenging because labour doesn't scale in that positive a way for profitability. It scales linearly. Now, the use of labour within circular fashion is probably not to be too surprising. Anyone that's worked within the circular economy more broadly knows that what you're really doing is shifting from the production of goods into the kind of moving of goods around and the repurposing of goods. So it's not surprising that labour is really a heavy aspect here. But I think within fashion in particular, given the range of SKUs, needing to authenticate that and actually sort, it becomes extremely challenging. What we found, though, is this huge interest at the moment in some of the technological innovation that can really change the game on this front. The challenge is, how do you augment the labour that's in that industry to make it more beneficial and scale profitably? And there's loads of exciting innovations out there at the moment, whether that's kind of embedded RFID tags, which Uniqlo and Zara have started to do. There's a lot of interesting QR codes on product labels now, along with kind of the digital product passport regulations that you're seeing within the EU. And there's also some really exciting newer innovation around kind of embedding flexible chips, kind of microchips that can almost be scanned to help with sorting and authentication. So there's a huge amount of innovation that's out there that's really going to change some of the dynamics here. I think probably to wrap up across those areas, what we found overall is that actually there's a bit of a subsegmentation in the market today as to who can make circular fashion profitable for them as a business. What you see is probably unsurprising, which is that the businesses that operate at the high end of the fashion space, whether it's luxury or kind of the affordable luxury space, clearly have the economics and the price point to be able to make this work. But at the moment, it's a bit of a challenge for brands, probably more at the high street end, to make some of the economics stack up. But probably the key finding, and what I'd like everyone to take away from this, is the economics are definitely not fixed. There are a huge number of levers that can be pulled to really change the dynamics, change the economics, make the industry more profitable. And I think probably the takeaway here is there are levers to be pulled. So for businesses out there looking to change their models, there is huge opportunity to make this a profitable endeavor.
Alex, thank you so much for that very concise and pointed intro. Very, very useful. I just got a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. Do you think, from your vantage point, do you think that brands have gone cold on textile recycling? And is that part of the appetite to look at reuse?
I wouldn't say they've necessarily gone cold. There's a lot of movement in the space, and certainly some of the kind of leading players have struggled in recent weeks, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Brands still continue to prioritize recycling. I think it's probably one of the key metrics that they're measuring themselves by. And if you look at a lot of the brands' targets, they certainly have a lot of targets around recycled content. And the interest in reuse, I would say, in recent years has been probably driven primarily by consumers who are really excited to get into this space and showing that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. It's a growing sector. I think brands are likely responding to that and trying to get in on that market. But how to do that is really challenging, both in a way that's profitable and in a way that doesn't cannibalize primary sales.
And I know this is, not necessarily your problem as such, but I was kind of interested because obviously this is client driven, it's profit driven. Where does that dovetail with what you might call activist concern or environmentalist concerns? Does it dovetail on stuff like decarbonisation? Do we get, if we look at this long enough and we crunch the figures, do we get to a point when we can see that there's actually a real decarbonising agenda here as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And Lucy, I think that's a really important point. And actually what you see is for a lot of companies, they have quite ambitious decarbonisation targets, whether it's for 2030 or 2040 or 2050. Net zero targets are really playing into this conversation. So a lot of brands thinking about how to get there will have some element of circularity built into their plans to try and achieve this. And so the real question is, how do you align that in the short term and make progress towards those net zero goals?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We'll bring you back in a minute. But first of all, we're going to hear from Libby, who's going to present on this report I keep banging on about, which is the new Green Alliance, Changing Fashion, What People Want from a Greener Clothing Industry. Libby, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see that. Lucy, do interrupt me if you can't, because I can no longer see the chat. And thanks very much for the endorsement of this report, which was put out on behalf of our Circular Economy Task Force, which is a business-led coalition that's calling for resource-efficient policies. We have various members, some of whom are flashed up on the screen there. PwC are one of them, but so are the other ones on the screen. And I would just say at the start that any sort of recommendations or mistakes or thoughts in the report are fully Green Alliance's responsibility. But the report wouldn't have been possible without the support of these groups and organizations. So thank them. I'd like to thank them very much at the start. And the reason that we started looking into this and what we wanted to add was an investigation of what people want from reuse, because we saw from the PwC research that was done for the task force that businesses can make money at the moment, and hopefully things will change in the future. So it's possible for businesses to make money, but at the same time as delivering what people and the environment need. And so we wanted to add to that and to see what the public is ready for in terms of what politicians, policymakers, and indeed businesses themselves can give them. But just at the start, there we go. I'll tell you a bit more about the report, which is called Changing Fashion. And we wanted to see what people thought, but I say our thoughts were really in line with this opening quote from Vivienne Westwood, which is in the report, which is buy less, choose well, make it last, quality, not quantity. Everybody's buying far too many clothes. And I think that's the sort of starting point of the report from us, is that we need to start thinking about reduction before we think about anything else. And it is Earth Day, as a couple of people have observed already. So just to highlight at the start, the sort of fashion industry in general has a really outsized environmental price tag compared to what you might expect it to be. I think an individual item of clothing looks quite innocuous and it doesn't feel like it's got as big an impact as some things, but all of the clothes that we have all together do add up to a very large impact. And the figures that we've got here are global, and there is quite a lot of uncertainty around them, which is something that definitely hampers progress on circular economy, on reducing, not knowing what we've got and what the impact of it is. But the estimates that are out there suggest that we should be really concerned. The fashion industry is responsible for 5 to 10% of global emissions, which is quite famously more than aviation and international shipping combined. But it also has other impacts, including around waste and pollution. 20% of industrial water pollution globally is thought to come from the industry. And the majority of clothing globally go to landfill or incineration after their first use. And one of the things that is quite difficult to find figures on is how much clothing is destroyed before it even gets used. That's because it's returned or because it can't find a market. And it's thought that globally as much as 40% could suffer that fate. So that's definitely something that we want to be mindful of and address as we're thinking about fashion. And despite rising awareness, I'd say, amongst the public, it's pretty sobering that a lot of the statistics continue to go the wrong way, including around consumption and around clothing use. So these figures, again, are global figures, but we know that the trends in the UK are similar. Clothing production is outstripping, the growth in clothing production is outstripping GDP growth at the same time as clothing use is falling. So what that means is that we own more and more clothes and we're using them less and less. We've got these bloated wardrobes and not enough opportunities to wear the clothes that we've got. And there was a slight dip during COVID, but after that, the trends have started going up again. And as I said, data is a real problem, but we do know from previous research that we probably have particular reason to be concerned about this in the UK. There was a European study that suggested we buy more clothing than any other country in the EU that was studied. And so we definitely think that we should be taking reduction and the things that can aid that, like reuse, much, much more seriously. So before we asked the public what they wanted to see, we did some research to see, well, how much actually could we reduce material used in the clothing industry in the UK, which is something that we've been trying to do because we're very conscious of the fact that resource use across the board is driving the climate crisis, as well as the nature's decline and the waste and pollution crisis that the UN is now labeling the sort of triple threat to the planet. it's all linked by resource use. And the suggestion is that the UK is using probably about twice as many raw materials as the Earth can sustainably supply per person per year. So our overarching concern is to see, could we realistically have that? And could we do that in high impact sectors like textiles? So we previously did some research into construction, found that it was possible to reduce material use by about 40%, using techniques and technologies that were available today. And we did a similar sort of analysis for the textile sector, and found that actually if you went for a transformative change, which was really maximizing reuse and recycling, what would the impacts be? And in our transformative scenario, we assume that the reuse rate can increase to 60%, which is up from about 25% today, the estimates suggest. And that the displacement rate, which Alex was talking about, so that means the extent to which reuse is replacing new purchases rather than being in addition to them. So we assume that the displacement rate could go up to 65% in this transformative scenario, and that recycling could meet its maximum potential of 53% fiber-to-fiber recycling. And that actually is a really big leap. It's a leap from less than 1% globally at the moment. But we do know that lots of businesses, as Alex was saying, are focusing in on recycling as something that they can do, and having recycled content in their clothes. So if you add all of those together, you could actually reduce material use in the sector by almost 2/3, which would be a massive saving. And then we did some research with YouGov to find out what the public wanted from this agenda. We surveyed over 2,000 representative adults in Great Britain, and found that the public is theoretically ready for change, and they do innately get the need to reduce and reuse before you do things like recycle, and they get that there is overproduction. 58% of them thought that the businesses were most responsible for fashion's environmental impact, so they definitely want help from businesses as well as from the government to act. We asked them for their 3 top preferences in terms of what they'd like to see from businesses, and there was a lot of concern about the production processes. So in joint top, there was the production process, there was the banning the destruction of unsold or returned goods, and there was partnering with charities to redistribute goods. And just on the banning of the destruction of unsold or returned goods, it's worth saying that the 85% of people, so an overwhelming majority, said that they thought it was wrong when unsold or returned, or even still wearable goods, were sent to landfill or incineration. And I think that probably shows the sort of power of a lot of media coverage that we've seen in recent years about companies that are sending things directly to landfill without them being used. It's an outrageous waste of resources, and the public really gets that. And then we gave them lots of different options for things that government might do, and we asked them which ones they would support. And it was quite heartening, I'd say, to see the results from this. And these are you'll see on the screen, you can see the top things that people wanted to see, but we did provide them with other options as well in terms of policy interventions, and the public supported all of them, most of them by over 75%. Targets for reduction, reuse, and recycling were overwhelmingly supported. And I think the thing that I liked most about these responses was that we didn't provide them with any sort of background about the fact that reduction is better than recycling, and better than reuse, but they innately chose targets for reduction as even more desirable than those for reuse or recycling, although they supported them all, as well as bans to sending clothing to landfill or incineration, and standards to improve durability as well as production processes. So what that says to us is that the government can certainly feel the support of the public if they're going to make some policy interventions, and they definitely should, starting with a well-designed ban to prevent these materials from going to landfill or incineration, and then also bringing in a really good system of extended producer responsibility, which feels like it's sort of fallen by the wayside when it comes to textiles. And that would mean that those who are placing the products on the market should be made financially responsible for their full life cycle impacts. And we'd definitely like to see the government get on with that and do plenty of other things besides. I'll stop sharing there.
Thanks, Libby. There's so much to dig into there. Just a couple of questions from me first. I guess I'm really interested in what public preferences add up to. So they give us a window on, you know, what thresholds, what people are actually sort of thinking, and how they navigate this issue. But as we saw with Climate Assembly, when I think I'm correct in saying that the preferences came out much more strongly than people thought. You know, the people who went through that process wanted to put tax on aviation and stuff like that. But that didn't really help when it came to pushing policy or the net zero agenda or what the government does or what gets written into law. So what does this kind of add up to, and how much of a pressure point is it from your point of view?
Well, I suppose you'd hope that it would be a useful reminder to politicians in an election year that this is something that the public is quite concerned about. And so as they're thinking about the policies that they're going to introduce, whoever happens to be the next government, they can start thinking about being much more ambitious than historically we have been in the UK in terms of our policy. I suppose one thing to note about the Climate Assembly is that public opinion can be quite useful if you want it to be, if you really want to understand and take on board what the public thinks. But if it's viewed as something that's quite dismissible, then it's not going to be as effective. So other places that have done things like climate assemblies, or who have done these big bits of public sort of consultation, have done so in a way that was designed to lead to policy change. So they've potentially, and if they use it, they do it quite effectively in Ireland, where they then put things to the public, the whole of the public, saying, do you agree with the people who did this consultation that we should be making these changes? And so the aim of public consultation, obviously we've not done this on behalf of government, but if the government wants to sort of take it on board and feed into their policy recommendations, there are ways of doing that, and we certainly think that they should be listening to the public on this, and the public are ready for change, so they can get on with sort of quite delayed plans to reduce waste and to bring in extended producer responsibility for textiles.
I think you know, when you've been around this issue for a long time and you've seen some pretty hideous parts of the industry, you don't get surprised that often. But even, you know, even this has the capacity to move me, let me tell you that. So, you know, you were saying that it seemed around, you know, 40% might even be destroyed before it gets used. You know, that's incredible, absolutely incredible. And one of the phrases that you used was that partly that is attributed to the fact that it can't find a market. So we've still got brands pumping out, you know, often plastic-based, synthetic fibered products into this ecological emergency when they haven't even, they don't even know where the market is. So they're really just taking a punt on whether they can sell it or not. I mean, it's absolute chronic, isn't it? Was there anything that surprised you, and where do you think the real headline? What do you think the real headlines are from the report?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite dispiriting, but I think the thing to take away from that is that it's not just a problem. We talk about consumption a lot and put the emphasis on the public, but it's not just a problem of over consumption, it's a problem of overproduction and business models that can afford to be so wasteful that they don't even need to find a market for everything that they're creating to be profitable. So I think the need to change that, to start by thinking about how can we address overproduction and create the markets for really high quality, durable goods that people will love and that won't be so disposable is really important. And businesses definitely have a role to play in that, as does the government, because it is, the stats are pretty shocking across the board when you look into them.
So just on the, finally, before we move into bring our other panelists in, when we talk about designing or high quality goods that people will hold on to, so there's some sense that a better designed, better quality product will have better durability. And in fast fashion, this is often interpreted as timeless classic pieces. So if you design in a classic way, say a black blazer for the sake of argument, that will stay in the wardrobe longer. However, when we have seen academics sort of research this, I think I'm right in saying Kate Fletcher, looked at this quite deeply. There isn't any evidence that that is the case. So there is a sort of mythology built into this. So how was that something you were aware of? How is that reflected?
We definitely were concerned about durability and figuring out how to make sure that things that are durable are actually desirable as well. And I think that that's something that does probably require more of a sort of societal conversation. So government can definitely start the ball rolling. Businesses can definitely move in the right direction. But there is going to be a potential challenge if, say, you do make durable standards, but they're not clothing that are sort of emotionally durable, and people don't want to hold on to them, or they're such sort of, they're made in the fashion that changes quite quickly. So it's not just about the physical durability and the policies, but it is something that the public does need to engage even more with to understand changing fashions and how we can make sure that something is durable, it's desirable for as long as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's bring back Alex, and let's also bring in Sarah Ottaway, who is Suez Recycling and Recovery Head. I think. Hello. Sarah's responsible for informing, enabling and supporting Suez in its triple bottom line strategy. And she's got 17 years experience in the sector. Well, let's bring that experience to bear. What did you make of the report?
Oh gosh, well, hello, firstly, everybody.
Hello.
It's great to be here. So yeah, trying to build on that 17 years experience, a lot of it around waste prevention. As much as I work for a company that moves items around so we can put them to best use, waste prevention has been the bedrock of my 17 years in the sector. And I think there's two parts of this that fit in so well with the role that Suez is trying to play in terms of driving the circular economy. And one is that public perception side, and just that growing evolution that we're seeing from recycling being the heralded savior of how we're going to reduce our environmental impact, to reuse and reduction. And like Libby said in her piece, that wonderful surprise that reuse and reduction got such a level of support through the survey work that the Green Alliance have been doing. I'm seeing that in other areas as well. So we recently did a report with Keep Britain Tidy, Greater Manchester, Merseyside and CWM earlier this year, and that showed a really similar picture. But just over 70% of respondents to that said that they wanted to see less advertising to buy things and more advertising from brands about how they can keep their items in use for longer. So we're seeing this real sea change in what the public are saying about what they want to do with their clothes and the items they use every day, which is really exciting. And that can be a powerful force for change when we're speaking to politicians and to brands about what they're trying to do through the networks that we have. And then there's the economics. This is a circular economy at the end of the day, so it has to stack up. We need entrepreneurs to be able to start and grow their businesses and be able to innovate and do all those exciting things that Alex was linking to. So much of that comes from that side of the sector. But at the moment, it is such a challenging environment. Depop, for example, I think it was a £50 million loss last year. Obviously, their investors still very much believe in them, as many of us do who use those sorts of portals. But even with that investment, it's still a really challenging environment. So that's where work like that Alex and the PwC team have done are so important to help kind of reassure investors that this is a good market to put their money in. It's only going to grow and evolve over time. So yeah, really excited to see them, and hopefully they're going to be really useful in the sort of engagement that comes next.
Yes, I think so. Just a quick question for you before we move on, and we'll jump into taking questions because we've got quite a lot of them. Incineration or energy from waste, as we call these technologies now. So surprise, surprise, there's absolutely no appetite or consent among public for burning products, for burning clothes. What is the Suez line on that?
In terms of burning clothes in terms of general? Well, unfortunately, it does end up in it ends up in the bin, and it ends up on our door. It goes through those facilities. Then sadly, that is what happens, and it contributes to the carbon footprint of us as a nation, because there is the carbon that comes from those facilities. We see the whole energy for waste process as a transition technology to move us away from landfill while we build, reuse, recycling, and repair. So we don't see it as a long-term solution, and that's why we're working with Green Alliance and others across the sector to drive the circular economy. Because at the end of the day, we see ourselves as a resources company, not a company that deals with that at the end of life, because that's where the future of dealing with our resources is. So hopefully they will be something of the past as soon as we all can transition our economy to that circular one we all want.
Okay, thank you. So let's just go to some of these questions here. Alex, here's a question. Recycling clothes into new clothes is really hard. Has PwC's report looked at recycling clothing into other industries?
So we didn't cover that as part of the report specifically, but we know that is typically what happens at the moment. If you look at where a lot of these materials that end up going into kind of recycling, or whether it's textiles that go into recycling end up, typically it is what we would normally see as called downcycling. So you can see a lot of them end up in kind of mattresses or other applications. I think probably longer term, the vision for the industry is certainly to move more towards the fiber to fiber recycling that Libby mentioned. And I think that there remains applications in other industries, but I think the vision long term is that you would keep it within fashion and have more direct recycling, because otherwise you see a kind of leakage in the chain and more requirement for new resources.
Is fiber to fiber really on? Because we've been hearing about it since the dawn of time. And it doesn't seem to be going very fast, because it's a tiny percentage, isn't it? And what are the barriers? Is it cost? Is it innovation? And when we're looking at don't we really have to tackle the increase in synthetics? Because I don't really see that much evidence that plastic is a circular material.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things there. I think there is fiber to fiber clearly has been, as you say, has been talked about for a long time. As you say, it's not necessarily there yet, but there's some really exciting technologies out there, some really exciting businesses that have started to make it work. And I think what we're hearing is that it is starting to scale, and we're starting to see more movement in that regard. One of the challenges clearly is, as you mentioned, Lucy, this kind of the usage of synthetics within materials. We've kind of seen a massive increase in blended textiles and blended clothing, and that as anyone involved in recycling, I'm sure Sarah can attest to this, that makes it incredibly challenging to separate these items out and actually get that back to a kind of good as new state. So that's clearly a key challenge, and I think there is clearly movement in recycling, but I think it's not there yet, and there remain a number of challenges for that industry.
Well, let's bring in Sarah, because you're our resources queen, so we should defer to you on these matters. Yeah, I mean, the same, fiber to fiber, do you think it's viable?
It has potential, and I think in terms of, especially what Libby was talking about in terms of that potential for the market and the report, it needs to be part of the solution, because that's the fiber makeup anyway that we're seeing, and that's not going to change necessarily overnight. I think Alex is totally right that the blended materials are placing a huge challenge in the way of this working, because so many of them are based on kind of single materials, single kind of blends of fiber, which is making it a really difficult environment. But this also opens up the whole conversation around producer responsibility, because actually so much of this is around investment, not just in the businesses themselves, but also in the innovation side of it too. And actually, if we had a well-designed, effective producer responsibility system, some of that money could be very effectively invested in developing that marketplace in a way that the market wants as well. So in a way that we are meeting consumer demand to a degree, while also considering that consumption point. So there's a real juxtaposition around some of this, but ultimately we want to get items away from landfill, away from an energy for waste facility into a circular one. So we need to make sure that we're bringing everything up to at least that recycling level before we, as well as obviously face all these different layers of the hierarchy at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Libby, so in a minute, I want to talk about the opportunities for resale and reuse, because that's what we've sort of identified, and that's probably very exciting to a lot of people on this call. But just on this subject, how much knowledge was there amongst the general public or the people that you surveyed? Did you think? And because actually some of the answers I think are very nuanced. So you know, is there a much higher understanding of the environmental impact of fashion? And are we able to sort of really weigh up these conversations about things like, do you prefer recycling fibre to fibre, or do you prefer resale? How much knowledge is there?
Well, we didn't do. I suppose it would be interesting to do a follow-on investigation into how much the public know. We sort of took this. The questions were done without providing the public with any information. So it was very much just assessing their opinions without presenting them with the facts. And the thing that we thought was most interesting is that even without us pointing out the considerable impact and the importance of reduction, people did innately understand that, and they seem to be quite familiar with the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. The fact that you need to do that in that order in a way that we haven't necessarily seen from policymakers. So I'm afraid I can't. We didn't ask them sort of testing questions to understand their knowledge, although we did consider it. But we didn't in the end. We just asked them, what do you think? What do you want to see in terms of solutions? Who are most important, and how concerned are you? And we found that they weren't necessarily saying that they were incredibly concerned about the environmental impacts, but I don't think that's because I don't think that's because people don't care about the environmental impacts. I think that does suggest that actually they're not necessarily told enough in a lot of ways. They're not necessarily, it's not on their agenda as much as it should be. But even though it wasn't, it was quite striking that they still wanted to see reduction first, and then reuse and recycling after that.
Yes, such a clear framing. I mean, it's not that surprising. You know, the waste hierarchy has been around for a long time. We've been learning it since we were babies. Okay, so let us, there was a great question here, which I wanted to ask you, Libby. We really need, where's it gone? Sorry. We really need long-lasting clothes in order for them to be reused over and over again, but presumably putting standards on this will drive up the price of clothes. What do we know about the public's tolerance of driving up the price? Because, as we know, the price of everything is going up.
That's definitely something that we need to talk about and we need to look into. But one of the interesting things that we found in our background research, and we didn't just actually talk to the public, we did talk to a lot of businesses and charities that are currently involved in reuse or wanting to get more involved in reuse. And one of the things that we heard from businesses was that standards for durability isn't necessarily going to drive up the upfront cost of the product. And actually the same can be said of standards for some of the standards that you might see around improving production. If you're looking at things like if you're improving production so that you use less water, for instance, that's water is a resource that costs companies money. So there are some ways in which this would not necessarily increase the costs across the board. And that was another thing that was quite heartening to hear, was that you can make better clothing without actually adding lots of costs up front to the public. The question is sort of the long-term market, how that's going to move so that you're buying fewer clothing but better clothing.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Let's bring you in again, if you don't mind. So when we're sort of saying to your clients, when we're saying to brands and retailers, etc., and wholesalers and all the rest of it, we need you to move away from volume-led sales. How does that go down, and what needs to happen? You know, obviously you're trying to make an argument here that actually the growth is to be found in reuse and resale. Is that enough? Are there any other arguments? How do we really push there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're exactly right. It's a bit of a challenge, right? But I think the key to it is how can you deliver what the key success factors for these businesses are, and in many cases that's kind of growth and profit. And I think in many senses what this report tries to set out is actually how you can drive those metrics without necessarily needing that volume-led growth. And I think that's the conversation, is where are the other sources of value, and potentially also to kind of feed in on that last question as well. There is clearly a growing consumer appetite for more sustainable practices and more sustainable fashion. And we've done some separate research that showed around half of consumers are willing to spend around 10% more on any given item for it to become sustainable. So there's clearly consumer demand, which can drive these changes. But I think, I mean, Lucy, to your point, kind of there are probably wider incentives that drive this as well. So clearly we touched on one earlier, which is the wider shift from these businesses to net zero. That will make an important shift in over the kind of medium term in driving changes in practice. And you've also got in some countries new regulation. So you might have seen recently in France, there's a kind of fast fashion tax effectively put in place for new items on the market. And these sorts of kind of policy interventions will help move the dial as well. So I think there's probably a range of different attributes there, kind of whether it's achieving net zero, policy change, and also clearly core to business is how can you make money from this shift. But there certainly are levers that can be pulled to help move that kind of decoupling from volume to growth.
Okay, brilliant. Sarah, so the waste industry really has to watch policy changes, and that's where it impacts probably quickest, probably before everything else. What policy or regulation are you seeing come into this sector which you think will have an effect? Do you at Suez, do you watch what you've probably got business in France, but are you watching this thing with interest? You know, how do you navigate through what is a tsunami of policy and regulation in to a degree, especially based on what was there before?
Yes, but I think we'd also argue there's not enough of it and it's not coming along quick enough as well. You know, we are, all the things that we're talking about now around EPR, on textiles, for example, that was being talked about 5 years ago. You know, we had kind of politicians, brands and everything in the room talking about the waste and resources strategy that DEFRA put out, and we've seen so little actual action come from it. I think we're, like many of us in the sector, or, and anyone linked in with that strategy and the hopes that it created, kind of feel that they've constantly been dashed and undermined because we have seen so little change. I think in terms of the beginning of that question, Lucy, things that we think that are really going to influence both our sector and beyond us. We talked about producer responsibility. It's we're wholeheartedly behind that, but we also have some interesting ones that are coming along the line. Firstly, from kind of waste reduction. There are waste reduction targets that the government have put in place. So that's really exciting in terms of actually it's residual waste. So trying to reduce the residual waste, which means will hopefully move more resources up the waste hierarchy, but also means an overall reduction, which doesn't seem to get talked about a great deal, but actually has the potential to have a really positive impact on driving these sorts of wholesale changes we're talking about. The other one is around emissions trading. So we're seeing a lot of conversations around emissions trading, which is all around carbon taxation. And at the moment, that's only focusing on energy from waste, which for us could have some, or for the whole sector, could have some really negative consequences. For example, it could make it cheaper to dispose of textiles, as it's pertinent, than it could be to recycle them, which is obviously a real challenge for the sorts of conversations that we're having. So I think there are some challenges coming along that could really undermine progress at the same time that we're equally trying to progress as we are the wider producer responsibility and beyond. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting policy, but more and quicker and driving the right behaviours is what we want to see.
That's really interesting about emissions trading as well. That hadn't even occurred to me. Libby, what sort of EPR interventions do you think would work at this point?
So we would like to see the UK ideally exceed what's being brought in other countries, what's being brought in at the EU level and what other European countries have done. The EU is bringing something in which is going to hold producers responsible for end-of-life treatment. It's going to make sure that they're setting up separate collection for reuse and recycling. But one of the things that's lacking there that would really potentially drive action is any sort of targets around reduction and reuse. And we've seen that targets really do drive action. So Sarah's just brought in the waste minimization target, and that's been brought in through the Environment Act. It's sort of across the board and is something that we'd welcome, but we were really quite disappointed that wasn't paired with something that was going to address the other end of the material cycle on the start. So there was potential that they were going to bring in a resource efficiency target, which would have seen changes at the front end, and ideally we'd say that should be a target on resource reduction. across the board, not resource efficiency, because that's a comparison to the economy, and so you can actually still increase resource use. So
why do you think that got shelved?
So they said that it got shelved because there wasn't the evidence, to base it on yet. And we do know that there is a lot of trouble with data across the board, but it is in government's wheelhouse to change that. If they wanted to improve the data, there are things that they could do, like bring in a national materials data hub, which they've promised, follow the EU's decision to bring in material passports, and fashion is one area that's going to be prioritized in the EU, to bring in digital product passports so you can track materials throughout the economy. And that could potentially be really, really useful. And the government does have powers now. It took a lot of new, really quite exciting powers in the Environment Act to set producer responsibility obligations, but it doesn't have any plans to use them yet. But it can set targets now for reduction. It can set them for reuse, as well as recycling. But insofar as we've seen any action on that, it does always still tend to focus in on things like recycling, on reducing residual waste, keeping things out of landfill. And that's not something that we want to stop them doing, but we do need to say that that's the final thing you should do after you reduce things as far as possible, and make sure that you embed things like reuse and repair. And the attention, certainly from the government, is almost always on keeping things out of landfill and or incineration. And that's very much an end of pipe solution, and not the sort of systemic change that we need to see across the economy.
Okay,
Lucy, can I just add in there as well?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
I was just to add to Libby's point, is that I think also that the challenge we have with government as well is that they see, as soon as we say reduction, they instantly go, oh, but we need to worry about tax revenues, and that HM Treasury has such an influence over government policy as a whole. So I think again it comes back to kind of Alex's research and proving that there's a real demonstrative kind of business case behind this, and actually it can create revenue, it can create taxes, and also that it can create jobs as well. There's huge amounts of potential around jobs. So a little bit of work we did was we estimated that 40,000 jobs could be created just by people having something repaired every year. So, and that's just it. There's a whole sweep of research around that, but there's all these other offshoots in terms of economic development, social benefits, as well as the environmental ones that come through this. So, we need to help Treasury and others see the potential, not just a reduction in those, precious pounds coming in to support our public system.
Well, when it comes to some fast fashion brands, His Majesty's Revenue might note that they don't get any tax at all. So, but we are paying to clean it up. So obviously there's a push there as well. We are getting close to time, so I just want to feed in some questions here. Alex, this is an interesting one. To what extent are brands willing to take up servitization models in-house, e.g. repair, cleaning, upcycling?
That's a really good question. And actually, I think what we've generally seen in the space is that brands typically have outsourced these. They're often very difficult, and as I mentioned earlier, kind of manually intensive processes that are not within the typical business models of brands. So what we've actually seen more of is actually third parties coming in to help service brands and partner with them to kind of fulfill the logistics, the cleaning and the repair, or the authentication. There is a little bit of work in-house, but I think as we kind of alluded to, you have to build up a lot of skills separately to do that. So probably the predominant model we've seen is the partnership model.
Okay, a really good question here, and people want news lines. Here we go. What are the panel's thoughts on Chanel suing a designer for repurposing their vintage scarves and clothing? We'll start with you, Alex, then Libby, then Sarah.
Well, I think it's a really interesting story, right? I saw this last week in the press, and I think it's all around the idea of how can you maintain brand value. And I think there's not necessarily a right answer on this one, but it certainly shows some of the challenges brands are kind of coming up against with how do you maintain brand value in a world where you maybe have less direct control over your products because they're circulating in other ways and being used in other ways. So I don't necessarily have a direct answer, but I think it certainly highlights some of the challenges that brands are leaning into with how do you manage the fact that a lot of your products, which are effectively your assets, how can that be used effectively, and how can you monetize that in this world of a more circular economy?
Libby, what were your thoughts?
I mean, I think there are sort of probably parallels with things like the right to repair, where you see people who have their own products and want to do things with their products and give them more value to them, and in the process reduce environmental impact by keeping materials in use at their highest value, or improving their value for as long as possible. So it does feel sort of like it goes against the general views that we've had from the public, that people want to see innovation, they want to see reductions in impact, and in that way, I suppose it's a shame that that's taking place still.
Yeah, and from a trend point of view, you can tell by the celebrities that have worn the pieces in question that they have a lot of cultural capital at that end of proceedings, so they're real like harbingers of trends. So it is a difficult one. Sarah, did you have anything to add?
I think Libby covered most of my points, to be honest. There were some impolite thoughts that, anger at it happening in the first place. But you see so many parallels with, some of the major electronics providers where they've sued repairers because they've repaired their products and put them on the marketplace, particularly those that are really protective and have really discouraged repair until more recently. But it shows also the power of persuasion and of continuing to promote the fact that these things need to change, because we've seen, particularly with some of the major electronics brands, they're starting to roll back on some of that protectionism as well. So hopefully we might see the same in this case too.
Okay, let's just stay with you. And just because we've had a lot of variations of this question, what is the role of export bans for waste in stopping countries like the UK just sending stuff abroad to pollute countries elsewhere? Is this part of the solution? Because we've seen that again and again and again with textiles.
Yeah, and exports are it's a really challenging one with textiles, isn't it? Because it's something that started off with really good intentions, many years ago, and it's turned into this kind of monster of an industry that still has a lot of good in it, but also a lot of negative associated with it too, because of the consequences that you've alluded to, Lucy. I think the bans have a role to play, but they equally have to also come along with that investment piece. So again, it comes back to that producer responsibility, because we're not stopping the tap at the other end. So there's still items coming through the system that something has to happen with them. If they don't go there, they're going to get destroyed somewhere else. So it's not as easy as going, let's just ban everything and hopefully stop the negative consequences going on. It's about investing in the system so we can make sure that we are putting these items back into good use in the right way, whether that's in the UK or anywhere else that they end up, but in the right place and being used in the right way is really important.
Okay, thank you. A lot of really good information there. I'm sorry we can't go on longer. There's some great stuff in the chat, including lots of resources to look at, people sharing reports. Thank you so much for doing that. Do read the report if you haven't done already, and do stay in touch. Let's keep this conversation going because it's very, very important. Unfortunately, we do have to leave it there. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, to Sarah, to Libby, and of course, Alex. And thank you for sharing some of your Earth Day with us today. I hope you've got a few little nuggets to explore and keep pushing this agenda forward. And I think always when we have a new report of this quality and this credibility, including one that tells us what the public actually thinks, we can use that, right? So with this mantra of pushing forward and fixing fashion, it's taking a while, but we are making progress. I want to say thank you very much and sign off and see you next time.